Okay. Welcome to everyone. If you've just joined, we are encouraging people to introduce themselves in the chat. Um, before we get started, okay, right, and this will be recorded. So just letting everybody know this is recorded and it will be available on the NASH website with the rest of the webinars in the series. Within 24 hours, this webinar will be available. The other ones are already up. Okay. So welcome to everyone. I'm delighted to be back helping to round out the last in this 4-part series, What Survivor Advocates Should Know About the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. Today, we're doing a topic that's very near and dear to my heart and that I hope will be very helpful for all of you. We're going to be focusing on using the Qualified Allocation Plan process to influence LIHTC priorities. Oops, jumped ahead. So as an introductory matter, I'm just going to tell you a teeny bit about my organization. And actually, for those of you who've participated in the entire series, I'm Rachel Blake, and I presented the very first 101 series, and I'm happy to be back to do that. And my colleague at Regional Housing, I have a colleague joining me this time who I'll introduce in just a second. So Regional Housing Legal Services is a legal services program that's in Pennsylvania. It's a statewide program. We focus on issues in affordable housing and community development. Our attorneys represent nonprofits that are building affordable housing and doing community development work. So we do things like provide counsel for nonprofits that are doing LIHTC developments, help with property acquisition and financing and all of that kind of stuff. We also have a number of folks who do policy work, either in addition to that development work or primarily do policy work. And that really can run the gamut of what issues we see are coming up related to housing in communities. So the speakers for today, as I mentioned, I'm Rachel Blake, and very lucky to have with me today, who will be handling the second half of the presentation today, Vanessa Raymond Garcia. So you will get to hear from her and not too terribly long. So we're going to start out today with a poll. And we just kind of want to do a sort of temperature check to see, you know, how you're feeling about what you've been able to learn about LIHTC from the beginning of this series. So if we can get that first poll question up, that'd be great. Okay, that's great. I know that at the very beginning we had a lot of nothing and little. So it looks like we've had some folks feeling a little bit more comfortable, and that's fantastic. So that's what we're hoping to do, to make this a little bit easier. And we are also, I'll mention this now before I forget, Regional Housing Legal Services has been working to create a website that contains a whole bunch of this information and additional resources. And you're going to get a sneak preview of some of what's on there. But we know that this is a new topic for lots of people, that it's very dense, and that it's going to take time to really feel comfortable with it. So we're trying to supplement the sort of recordings of these webinars with some additional resources. So, so what we're going to cover today is really two big topics. We're going to be looking at what is the QAP, Qualified Allocation Plan. What is it? How does it work? And I'll be taking that part. And the second part is going to be Vanessa talking to you about what we've been able to learn about what states, how states are using their QAPs to help survivors, or maybe not do so much to help survivors in those QAP documents, and where there's opportunities to really engage in some advocacy to try to sort of shift, to move the needle. So just to reorient folks, I know it's possible that there are folks who've been on the call, who've been through all 3 of the other webinars, and There may be some folks who are just joining this one. I'm just going to do really high level on the stuff that we've covered before, just to sort of reorient. If you didn't participate in the other webinars, or if you've forgotten, which would be totally understandable because it's been a long year and it's been a bunch of months, you can definitely get the links back to the recordings from NASH. And I think they may already be in the chat, or they were going to be in the chat. So, so just to remember, sort of, why are we even talking about LIHTC at all? You know, it's an important resource that can really help survivors. It is the largest housing program in the country at this point. Like, there's the largest number of units have been developed with LIHTC. It was created in the late 80s. There's over 3 million units, and about 100,000 new units are built or made available every year. So it's just growing, while other programs have been losing funding and sometimes losing units. It also has the ability to have units be set aside for survivors, which is a really key strategy to help create more availability for affordable housing for survivors. And it also has attached to it special legal protections, which there was a whole session on. So this is doing it no justice, but hopefully you were able to attend that session. But basically, you know, there's housing related protections for folks in LIHTC related to discrimination, not being able to discriminate against folks who have experienced violence, who are survivors, and then also a whole list of protections and rights to help make sure that survivors can keep their housing. So this is just an example, a couple of examples that I pulled up from that were in the news this year in 2020 of developments across the country that have units set aside for survivors. And the units ranged between, I think it was 12 and 23, depending on the development units set aside targeting survivors. So there is a real potential to make significant units available for folks that weren't there otherwise. So that's one of the reasons that you want to pay attention to LIHTC and pay attention to the QAP. So I'm going to walk you real quickly through, again, this is still refresher here. And I talked about this in the first webinar. What matters for our purposes today are just the top row here. So LIHTC, the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, is a tax credit program. It's federally created. So the IRS allocates tax credits, an amount of tax credits to each state based on its population. Each state has an agency, an allocating agency, that's responsible for implementing LIHTC in the state. And one of the main ways that they do that is by adopting a Qualified Allocation Plan. And that includes a lot of things, which we're going to talk about in more detail in just a minute or two. But one of the ways that the QAP functions is effectively like an RFP, like a request for proposal. So it says what somebody has to submit if they want to try to get tax credits, like how many copies of something and what dates, and then what kind of points they're going to get for different kinds of activities. And that's how they can incentivize, how the agency can incentivize different kinds of development targeted at different folks. So then the developers read the QAP and they submit their proposal. In most states, it's incredibly competitive to get these tax credits. Way more people want them than there are available. So if the agency does incentivize, say, developments that target survivors, it's pretty likely that you're going to get some developments that target survivors at the end of the process. And then the allocating agency will award the tax credits to some developers based on their priorities from the QAP. So what is a QAP? At its most basic level, it's a PDF that can be between 10 and like 100 pages. They really vary by state. But it's a federal requirement for the LIHTC program. The federal law requires that each state agency come up with a Qualified Allocation Plan. Like I said a minute ago, it really functions like an RFP, and it tells the developers what they need to do, the sort of bare minimum criteria, and then it sort of tells them what they'll get additional points or credit for doing. So I'm going to apologize in advance because I've been I really wanted to make this as accessible as possible to folks, to not overwhelm you with the details, because generally you don't need them to engage with the QAP, but I wanted to give you just these, I have 2 slides here that are a little bit more in the weeds. We'll just dip in real quick and then we'll come right back out, okay? So the Qualified Allocation Plan, again, is required by the federal law. And there's a couple of things that have to be in the QAP. So number one, it's required to give preference to projects that serve the lowest income tenants for the longest period and that are located in qualified census tracts. So those are required preferences that have to be in the QAP. There's also a listing of, I believe, 10 different items that the state agencies must include and make some sort of statement about what they want in these areas. So that could be project location, it could be like the project. So project location, for example, in Pennsylvania right now, we've been recently having an urban round and a rural round. So they separate out even how they give out the tax credits to make sure that they're spreading the money around. Different states will do it in different ways. The project and sponsor characteristics, they might say that they have a certain target for nonprofits doing the development, for example. But all of these topics, the topics have to be addressed, but how they have to be addressed is not set. The feds don't say that at all. They just say you have to talk about it. So states will all talk about these things, but in very different ways. So ultimately what they have is a lot of discretion to figure out how to implement those areas. And one of the topics that's particularly important in this context is there's one of the 10 categories that has to be addressed is tenant populations with special needs. And in a lot of cases, states include survivors in that definition. They'll actually define the terms and they may or may not include survivors in that category. So that's one real opportunity and something that you can look for when you go to look at your state's QAP. You can also, there's also flexibility to add other priority issues. So those 10 are a floor, but they can add kind of whatever additional things they want. They can go above that and add other issues. The other thing that the QAP can really do, because the document is so important, because it's the sort of gateway into getting money, right, and to being able to do developments, it really is an important tool to educate developers about key legal protections like the Violence Against Women Act, and to include some requirements about how the projects, how the properties, how the developers are implementing VAWA. So there's a lot that can happen in that one document. It's really very important. So you can be part of making changes to the QAP. It's a document that is generally issued every year. It can vary a little bit. Sometimes states do them for multiple years. There's a few funky states out there. But roughly it's going to be annually, and there's going to be some kind of public comment period where you can submit comments or possibly talk at a public hearing. Again, it's going to vary by state what that looks like. And they make changes. So what states will do is they'll issue a draft QAP that their staff has come up with, like these are the changes they think they're going to make for the year. And then people can submit comments through this public process saying, hey, yeah, why don't you incentivize development that targets survivors? Or why don't you require this particular thing related to the implementation of VAWA? Like whatever your issues are in your state are things that you can ask for.
Rachel, this is
Yeah.
Carlo. Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
I'm the Director of Legal Initiatives at NASH. There's a question just about the qualified census tract that you mentioned in the previous slide and where people can find the census defined criteria.
Okay, yeah, I kind of just waved my hand right over that, right? Because it's because it's a little in the weeds. But what I can do, that's one of the, you can find that on like Policy Map is a tool that we use that does mapping that has that on there. And I can, when I finish speaking and hand it over to Vanessa, I can go hunt down that link and send it to you if that's helpful, right?
Yeah, that'd be great. If you could put
Yep.
it in the chat box too.
Yep. I'll do that. Yeah. That's what I meant. Yeah. I'll put it in the chat box when I'm done. And if there's more questions later, we could talk offline about that, but that's, yeah, kind of to the side of the issue today. Um, so this is an infographic that we put together a few years ago, actually, that sort of walks you through the steps um, for doing advocacy with a QAP. So I'm going to skip over the first two squares because we've already kind of covered that today. Um, but to remind you that the QAP covers a bunch of different topics, right? And there's these requirements about looking at these 10 different areas, some of which we have listed here, and then they can add kind of whatever else they want. You do again have the opportunity to comment in this formal process, and that even relatively minor language changes can end up having a pretty huge impact. We strongly suggest, if you can, bringing, partners together. If you have multiple folks commenting, that can make a difference. And I'll also say that in our state, which is Pennsylvania, and I think in a lot of other states, the way that this usually operates is it's the same people making comments every year, right? It's a handful of people who are in this sort of like, who are developers or maybe some policy folks, um, making comments all the time. And so if you haven't been making comments, and then you show up with some comments and some partners, it's going to catch people's attention. Um, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll instantly do it, but you're definitely going to get people paying attention if you do that. And then you are going to want to watch, to try to figure out when the commenting period is. Unfortunately, there's no set date that it happens in every state, and even from state to state, they come out at different times in the year. So that's a little bit frustrating in some ways, but we'll give you some ideas, um, either here on the website, about how to sort of make it a little bit easier to figure that out. So, sorry, my finger's slipping. So the first step I think that you want to think about, if you're interested in getting involved, in doing some advocacy with your QAP, is to like go get your state's QAP. And so I put in links to two different ways to go about it. The first one is they're both through Novogradac, which is a national like tax consulting accountant organization, but they have like a lot of resources about LIHTC. One of them is this comprehensive listing of QAPs, and they put them out by year. And so the link in the slide is for 2021. Um, but you can see on the left, once you click through, there's like lots of years, and you'll see draft QAPs, and then you'll see final QAPs. So you can take a look at what your state's doing there. You can also just find your state agency, and again, I went to Novogradac for that listing, um, and just click through to your state agency, and look for the QAP there. So about this question about how do I know when I can comment, and this is about the sort of formal public comments. And let me actually stop and just say this here, like, ideally, one of the things that you want to do is to try to build relationships with somebody or some people on staff at the agency, and start educating them and bringing them along with the importance of the issues that you're trying to advance, right? That will help make the formal comment period comments, um, probably stick a little bit better. Um, but this is in terms of the formal comment period. Knowing when, like I said, is not, there's no clear, easy answer for what the date is. So one of the things you might want to do is, if you're not sort of connected to this world, right, is you could check the Novogradac website to see when a draft QAP comes up. That would be one way to do it. If you follow the links that I gave you before to get to the state agency's website, you can get familiar with their website and see where they post notices, or check the LIHTC page. Some state agency websites are really great and easy to understand, and some of them are pretty hard to find things on, in my experience. Um, a lot of them will also have the mailing lists, where they would have notices like that would go out on the mailing list. You could also follow them on social media. I think some of them promote those kinds of things on social media as well. So those are just some ideas for how you can get alerted to a formal public notice period. But again, like I mentioned at the beginning of the slide, if you've been able to build some relationships with folks, um, uh, that could be another way, right? If you've got some contacts at the housing agency and they know that you're interested, you could say, hey, can you let me know? Or just ask them, when's the next period? Like they'll know when it's coming probably. So wanted to give you a few other sort of things to think about as you start doing this process. Um, there's going to be some more sort of nitty gritty things about like what you might recommend, and Vanessa's going to give you sort of um, some insights into some of the things that you might want to think about. But this is just talking about, you know, really getting ready to sort of dig in. And so I suggest if you're interested in doing this, start thinking now. Don't wait for that public comment period. Start thinking now about what you'd really like to change. Try to find, like I said before, some partners. It really does help if you have some partners. Um, Ideally, you can find some language, some model language from other states. So that's something that you'll see a little bit from Vanessa and that we'll have on our website. But these state agencies often are influenced by what other states are doing. So if you can find, say, Georgia or Ohio, somebody has some good language in an area that you're really concerned about, you can basically lift that language and include that in your recommendation. Um, and again, this talking to your state agency staff is really helpful. It's not always easy to build those new relationships, but it's really worth doing. And the main thing I want you to think about is being persistent. This is not, it's not super easy. It's a financial resource that's highly contested, right? So there's a lot of people with a lot of interests um, trying to, right, in lots of different ways. And so you have to be persistent and just keep going. And I think there's a very high chance in most states that you'll be able to get some movement. I like to share this because it makes me feel better when, when I feel like that I'm facing a situation that's like, kind of confusing or overwhelming. Like I love this idea that it's just like, um, you know, success should be easy and clear in a straight line, and it just, especially with things like this, it just isn't. And so, for those of you who really like that straight line, I feel you. I'm with you. But just take a deep breath if you feel like it's starting to spin around, and just know that if you keep going, you're more likely to get to where you need to be. Okay, sorry. And then there's one other note that I want to add before we're going to do one more. I'm going to do one more poll with you, and then I'm going to hand it over to Vanessa. Um, so another thing that kind of plays into how states are handling some issues that relate to survivors, especially the sort of VAWA rights and protections, is a document called the Compliance Manual. And where the QAP was, like I said, kind of an RFP that gives you sort of, that really comes into play like when people are trying to get funded, the Compliance Manual is like kind of like an operating manual for the property, roughly, right? Like it answers some day-to-day stuff and talks about some like compliance that the agency needs to do for IRS purposes and other compliance that they might want. And so some of the VAWA rights and protections do show up in the compliance manual. So when Vanessa shares things with you later, I think you'll get a little bit more of a flavor for that. But we just wanted to let you know that's out there, because that can be equally as effective as having something in the QAP. But the QAP is where you're going to have, where most things were for most states, and where you're going to have that public process in place. The other thing that's important to know about compliance manuals is some of them hardly ever get updated. Like we reviewed them Um, like you're going to see from Vanessa in a few minutes, but some of them are many, many, many years older. So they don't get updated nearly as often as the QAPs. And I meant to do this, I can add a link to the compliance manuals too on the Novogradac site. I'll put that in the chat box here when I'm done too. So we just wanted to stop and do a temperature check here before I hand it over to Vanessa. How interested are you feeling in trying to figure out if you can advocate with your state agency? Understanding, I'll say that I know that this is a big step, and there's a lot of sort of work to get there, but just wanted to do a room check. Okay, that's great. So thank you so much for coming to this session and to the entire series or most of the series, for those of you who are able to do that. I think Carlo and I have been talking for years about wanting to really open up this LIHTC issue to more folks, because there's a lot of voices that don't get, that aren't part of these conversations. Like I said before, a lot of the comments for the QAPs are the sort of same folks. And so you're going to get the same kind of policy that way. So that's it. I'm going to hand it over to Vanessa. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rachel. So hi, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Vanessa. Really excited to be here with you all today. And just like a little funny human note, I'm actually wearing the same scarf that I'm wearing in my headshot, which is, I think it's pretty funny. But anyway, so I'll be covering the second part of the presentation, focusing here on the top line and major takeaways of an analysis we at Regional Housing did on states' regulation documents, or more plainly, the Qualified Allocation Plans and the compliance manuals. So in the next few slides, I'll be showing a series of maps that will show you the big picture of where your state stands on protections for survivors. So keep an eye out for your state and maybe take note of how many of the following metrics they fall into. Again, this may sound very technical, just to echo what Rachel said, but my hope is that the explanation in the next few slides will help make it easier to understand. So this first map shows all the states that have specifically named survivors as special populations, meaning states are encouraging the development of housing for survivors in these states. If you notice, you'll see a few states have some overlap in both the Qualified Allocation Plans and the compliance manuals, which is beneficial given the uses of both documents. Combined, about half of the 50 US states include survivors as a special population. And I'll give you a minute just to process the map. Great. So this second map, or maps I should say, shows which states have included the Violence Against Women Act in the language of their documents as a law they need to follow. Again, combined, about half of the 50 states includes VAWA as a law to be complied with. That also means that about half of the states in the US don't have any protections spelled out. I want to emphasize that specifically, spelled out for survivors in these documents for LIHTC units, but the protection still exists. And I can't highlight that enough, regardless of whether or not these protections are spelled out in these documents, those protections are still there for these folks. So spelling out a law and regulations documents is, of course, a pretty low bar, and unfortunately, many states still haven't met that. The 2013 reauthorization of VAWA is when LIHTC became included in this umbrella of protections, and clearly, 7 years later, we have a ways to go. Now, these next few slides are going to delve into the metrics developed by the teams at Regional Housing and NASH, as well as language in the federal VAWA law that discuss rights and protections and best practices that should be in place for survivors who live in LIHTC units. I'll go into what these two categories mean in a few slides. This map that you're seeing now specifically states states that do not have any rights and protections to offer survivors. This map shows about 20 states that do not have any protections. And so I'm sure you're wondering, after all this talk about rights and protections and best practices, what do these things mean specifically? So here's a list of what those rights and protections specifically mean. These are metrics that we used and are based on the language that's found in the federal VAWA law on what safeguards should exist for survivors. As an extra point, there are 3 buckets that these 6 items, as well as the best practices that I'll show later, can go into. And those 3 include education, the second, procedures and or protections for tenants, and the third being monitoring and enforcement. I'll give you a few seconds to read through the slide. Great. So now, if you're wondering how these things are spelled out in states regulations documents, here's a good example of how to include all of the rights and protections language in either or both qualified allocation plans and compliance manuals. This specific example is from Ohio's 2020 Qualified Allocation Plan and includes all 6 of the protections on the previous list, which are highlighted here for you. And I'll give you a minute to read through as much as you can of those items highlighted. Okay. Next, we're going to be talking about those best practices I mentioned earlier. So this map shows states that do not have any best practices measures in place, which includes, again, about 20 states. And as I'm sure you've noticed by now, there's a trend here of about half the states including some of these protections in their documents with a mix and match of those states. And so here's the list of the best practices that we looked for in each state's documents. These originated through input from survivor advocates like yourselves, housing officials, and other experts working with the domestic violence and sexual assault survivor population. As I'm sure you've noticed, many of these would fall into the enforcement bucket I talked about earlier. I'm sure you can also guess how many states have written the ones in with more teeth into their regulations documents. And so here's an example for model language for best practices. And to reiterate, this one was kind of trickier to find an example for, given how many of the measures from the list are excluded from many states' compliance manuals and qualified allocation plans, given that a lot of the monitoring and enforcement measures require other things and are more teethy, so to speak. So this example is from Delaware's 2020 Qualified Allocation Plan and includes at least 3 of the items in the monitoring and enforcement bucket from the list from the previous slide. And now the last point that I'll mention, and this actually came from some of the feedback we received early on about the series from survivor advocates like many of you, is whether or not folks can apply to LIHTC units based on their immigration status. You don't have to be a citizen to be in LIHTC funded housing, and it's on a state-by-state basis whether or not a prospective tenant will be required to provide a social security number during the application process as it's written in the documents. For the purposes of this presentation, we wanted to show you which states explicitly mention asking prospective tenants for their social security number as an income verification requirement for their compliance manuals. If you'll notice, the only one that included it in their qualified allocation plan was Delaware. Besides that, there may have been one other state. We also have additional data on which states offer the option to present other kinds of documentation for income verification, and we'll be sharing that at a later point on the website that we've mentioned. All in all, these are the major takeaways of the analysis we ran. States can encourage development of housing for survivors. With the help of many of you, this can be a better process for folks. As with many other issues, VAWA and LIHTC requires vigilance and holding folks accountable. The number of states that at least mention VAWA applies in the Qualified Allocation Plan or Compliance Manual has increased significantly over the last 5 years. However, only about half of the states articulate any of the key VAWA rights in these documents, so more progress can be made. Enforcement mechanisms are the weakest link. Models exist, you don't have to recreate the wheel. And there are multiple groups within the survivor community that need and deserve access to these resources. And I'll note, while these are the major key points that we wanted to share, we have much more data for you to delve into and take a look at on all of those best practices and the rights and protections that we mentioned. We break down each of those questions for you, and you'll be able to access that at a later point, and we'll be sure to let everyone know about the website launch where all of that data is going to be housed. And we have one final question for you all today, and it's a little bit different than how it's worded here on the slide, but on the poll question, just answer the question that the poll will show you. And that is, if a website with even more resources on this topic would be helpful to you, please select the resources you would like it to contain. Thank you. Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer the question. Yeah, all of these things, most if not all of these things, we'll have housed on the website, and we'll also have other links available for you to check out other resources that exist that either Nash, Regional Housing, or some other organizations pulled together for you. Okay, and that's about it. So we just want to let everyone know that the folks at Regional Housing, myself and Rachel, we're more than happy to take any individual questions that you have through our email, through social media. We'll be here to answer questions that you have for the next few minutes in the chat. And just to let you know that the website for the project will be www.vawahome.com, and we'll let you all know when that website will be launched. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today, and we really appreciate any of the other sessions that you were able to make. So thank you.
Great, thanks. Thank you so much, Rachel and Vanessa. That was such a great informative presentation. So the website that's here is not live yet, like Rachel just mentioned in the chat. We're likely going to be launching it in the new year. And so it'll have a lot of the information about the mapping that Vanessa presented and Rachel also referred to, as well as many of the tax credit resources that were mentioned throughout the presentation today. So this is the Q&A period, so if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. I did want to let you know, this presentation focused on the Qualified Allocation Plan process. And, some of you might be familiar with that. You might have heard of it. You may have even engaged in that public commenting process, or this might be completely new to you. And I just want to let you know that NASH is part of our technical assistance and support to local domestic violence and sexual assault organizations. We are supporting local organizations who want to become engaged in the QAP process locally. So we've helped, like, for example, the Pennsylvania DV Coalition to help them submit QAP comments for the first time this past year. And so we're happy to talk you through the process. And also, if you're interested in actually submitting comments, there are actually a lot of really great examples from other domestic violence and sexual assault organizations that have engaged in this process. So we're also happy to do some peer-to-peer calls if that's helpful to just sort of learn from each other about what that was like and if it makes sense for your organization to be part of that process too. So let's see. So it doesn't look like we have any questions right now. There were a couple of resources that I just sort of quickly put into the chat box because it seems like whenever we talk about VAWA or VAWA's housing protections, there's always questions that folks have about, what does VAWA cover? Does it cover the human trafficking question? So that was one of the questions that was entered into the chat box, is whether or not human trafficking survivors are covered by VAWA. And the answer is they're not explicitly covered by VAWA. So a human trafficking survivor would have to fall into one of the definitions of the existing categories of survivors that are covered by VAWA. So that would be domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. But I would just want to have you keep in mind that these definitions are actually defined very broadly within VAWA. So for example, domestic violence actually includes the way that states and localities define domestic violence. So here in California, because of the expansive way that the state's family violence laws has defined domestic violence, it includes violence between siblings, grandchildren and grandparents, parents and kids, as well as roommates that don't have any kind of blood relationship. So just keep that in mind that, VAWA is very expansive and it is intentionally supposed to be expansive. Let's see. Okay. Well, I don't know if Rachel and Vanessa, if you have anything you wanted to elaborate further on, because it doesn't look like we have any questions right now.
This is Rachel. I just want to, it's December in a really long year. And I'm just so, to be honest, just delighted with how many people still at the end of the year we're willing and able to sort of, log in and try to start engaging with this topic. Like Carlos said, some of you may already know pretty well, and some of you may be like, what is going on here? And so I really, really appreciate your time and your interest. So that's on the personal side. Substantively, I would only just reiterate that we really do also want to be a resource. Obviously, Carlo, you're in completely capable hands with Carlo, but if folks want to reach out to Regional Housing with any questions, and certainly about the website when it goes live, please feel free to do that.
I don't have, this is Vanessa, I don't have anything else to add other than, the website will be launched and you can find a lot more stuff there. And thank you. Just echo my fellow panelists, folks. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Okay, well, then I think we can go ahead and close the webinar early, which I've never done, I don't think. I feel like I'm making up for a prior webinar. If you all have been part of the webinar series, on one of the webinar series, we had like 8 speakers and we actually went over 20 minutes. So I feel like we're making up for that right now. We're just giving you some time back. So, well, thank you, everyone. Please be on the lookout for the launch of the VAWA website. Nash and I think RHLS will have some email blast that'll go out that'll talk to you about the VAWA home website and also other tax credit resources that'll be available. So please be on the lookout for that in the new year. But otherwise, thank you again for joining. We really appreciate you and all the critical work that you do with survivors every single day. It's just so important. And 2020 is ending, so let's all hope for a better year next year. Please stay safe and take care, everybody. Talk to y'all in the new year.